when everything falls apart. Have you ever stood in a season that felt like everything you loved was being stripped from you, one loss at a time? Not a dramatic collapse, just a slow, aching unraveling, where each sunrise brings more absence than comfort. That's where Ruth's story begins. Not with love or legacy, but with loss. Long before she became known as the woman who found favor, Ruth was just another face in a grieving household. A Moabite by birth. A widow by tragedy. A woman caught between broken promises and barren soil. But the story doesn't begin with Ruth. It begins with famine. The book of Ruth opens with a quiet disaster. There was a famine in the land. Bethlehem, ironically named House of Bread, had run dry. And so Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons left the land God had given them to seek food in Moab. It was a practical decision. But sometimes practical choices can lead to spiritual drift. Moab wasn't just another country. It was a place born of compromise. A nation that worshipped other gods. And for 10 years that's where Naomi's family stayed. There her sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Maybe Naomi hoped that at least this meant stability. Maybe she thought they'd finally found a new beginning. But then came the losses. Elimelech died. Then Mahlon. Then Chilion. No husband. No sons. No grandchildren. Just Naomi. And 2 foreign daughters-in-law with empty arms and eyes full of quiet questions. Naomi began to call herself bitter. She said God's hand had gone out against her. She didn't try to spin it or dress it up in theology. She was just broken. And she was ready to go home. But the way home was not a simple road. It would be a journey through dust and grief. And for Ruth, it would mean choosing between familiarity and faith. We often celebrate Ruth's loyalty, but we forget the weight of what she walked through first. She was a widow, a foreigner, and now she stood at a crossroads that would redefine everything. When Naomi told her and Orpah to return to their people and gods, she meant it kindly. She believed she had nothing left to offer them. Orpah wept and then turned back. But Ruth clung. Not out of naivety. Not because she thought it would be easy. But because something in Naomi's God had captured her soul. And even before we hear Ruth speak those famous words, we see something sacred in her silence. Sometimes faith doesn't start with declarations. Sometimes it begins with a grip that refuses to let go. If you've ever stood in a season where it felt like everything was slipping through your fingers, where the future was as uncertain as the road ahead, you're not alone. Ruth's story doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with survival. With showing up, with staying. Share this with someone who is walking through loss and wondering if anything redemptive can come from it. And if you've ever made a hard choice to keep walking forward through grief, write this below. I am still moving even when I don't know where the road leads. The road to nowhere and the woman who stayed. Have you ever walked away from everything familiar with no guarantee that what's ahead will make sense? Not because it was safe. Not because it was wise, but because something inside you said, this is the road I must take, even if it leads through unknown wilderness. That's what Ruth did. We tend to romanticize her words, frame them as poetry. But those words weren't rehearsed, they were a rupture. A breaking away from one life and a step into something no one expected. Let's go back to that moment. Naomi stood on the road out of Moab, grief heavy in her posture, ready to return to Bethlehem alone. She had already buried her husband and both sons. She had nothing left in her hands. No dowry. No hope. No assurances. All she had was a bitter heart and 2 young women who had every cultural and emotional right to go back home. Orpah wept. She kissed Naomi and turned back. No one judged her. Not even the scriptures. Her decision was the rational one. Stay where it's safe. Go back to what you know. Preserve what little life you can. But Ruth did something no one expected. She clung. And then she spoke. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Ruth 1 verses 16 to 17. This wasn't mere loyalty. It was conversion. A Moabite woman, shaped by foreign gods and unfamiliar with covenant, was choosing a God she barely knew, based only on the reflection of him she had seen in Naomi. That's the mystery. Even in Naomi's bitterness, even in her sorrow, even while she claimed the Lord had turned against her, something about her life had made God real to Ruth. Have you ever considered that the witness of your pain might be the very thing that draws someone else toward God? Ruth wasn't following prosperity. She wasn't hoping for marriage or fortune. She was following the whisper of something eternal, something holy, something she couldn't name yet, but knew she needed. And Naomi, out of arguments and too tired to protest, let her come. So together they walked. Two widows. One older, worn down by time and sorrow. The other younger, full of quiet determination. And the road they walked wasn't symbolic. It was dusty, long, likely dangerous. Two women without male protection, crossing from a cursed land to the place of promise. Ruth knew the stairs would come. She knew that in Bethlehem she would be the foreigner. She wouldn't belong. She wouldn't be welcomed. But still, she walked. Because sometimes the first act of faith isn't standing on a mountain or calling fire from heaven. Sometimes it's putting one foot in front of the other when every part of you wants to turn back. And when they reached Bethlehem, the whole town stirred. Naomi was recognized. Can this be Naomi? But she answered with a sting. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Ruth 1 verse 20. Even then Ruth said nothing. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to make an entrance. She simply stood beside Naomi as the sun set over Bethlehem and the barley harvest began. It's easy to admire Ruth after Boaz, after the wedding, after the redemption. But the real story is that she chose covenant when all she had was emptiness. She followed a foreign god based on faith, not familiarity. She walked toward nothing, trusting that grace might be waiting there. Maybe you've been there, on your own road to nowhere, following God without clarity, without applause, without a map. Just the sense that leaving your old life behind was the only way forward. You are not forgotten. And you are not foolish. Some of the greatest stories in Scripture begin with roads like that. Share this with someone who has left something familiar behind and needs to know it wasn't in vain. And if you've ever clung to God in the dark, trusting Him with no guarantee, write this in the comments. I'm walking forward even if no one else understands why. The gleaning season. Obedience in the fields of the unknown. Have you ever had to show up day after day in a space where you felt unseen? Doing hard work, making quiet sacrifices not for applause or recognition, just to survive, just to be faithful to what little you had left? That's what Ruth stepped into when she asked to glean. Bethlehem was a city stirring with the excitement of harvest. Barley stalks waved in the breeze. Joyful shouts rose from workers bundling sheaves. For many it was a season of abundance. But for Ruth and Naomi, it was a season of bare beginnings. They had no land, no inheritance, no men to provide for them. But they had the law of the Lord. And tucked inside that law was a provision few noticed. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. Leviticus 23 verse 22. That small mercy, God's care for the forgotten, became Ruth's open door. She rose early. She didn't wait to be told what to do. She asked Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain." and with quiet courage she stepped into the margins. Let that settle for a moment. The story of her redemption began not with romance, but with gathering scraps at the edge of someone else's field. She wasn't there for status. She wasn't chasing a man or a miracle. She was obeying step by step in a field that didn't belong to her, in a land where she didn't yet belong. And the scriptures record something subtle yet profound. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Ruth 2 verse 3. As it turned out. No angel announced it. No divine thunder marked the moment. Just providence wrapped in ordinary movement. That's how God often works. You think you're just surviving, He's positioning you. You think you're just trying to make ends meet, He's preparing a meeting. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and immediately noticed the unfamiliar figure among his workers. "Who does that young woman belong to?" he asked. The answer came. "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi. She asked to glean and has worked steadily from morning till now." Boaz saw more than just a foreigner. He saw faithfulness. He saw humility. He saw someone who wasn't waiting for handouts, but who was ready to labor for what God had made available. So Boaz approached Ruth with kindness, not distance. He told her to stay in his field. He ordered his men not to touch her. He gave her access to water, to protection, to dignity. And when Ruth asked, stunned, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz responded not with flattery but with reverence. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done." Ruth 2 verses 11 to 12. He didn't see her as someone beneath him. He saw her as someone whose quiet obedience had moved heaven. Boaz gave Ruth more than access, he gave her abundance. He invited her to eat at his table. He told his workers to leave extra stalks behind for her. And she gathered until her arms were full. That evening when she returned home, Naomi's eyes widened at the harvest in her daughter-in-law's hands. She asked where Ruth had gleaned, and when Ruth mentioned Boaz, Naomi's mourning lifted just slightly. "The Lord bless him," she whispered. "He has not stopped showing his kindness." And so Ruth stayed. Day after day, season after season, gleaning behind the harvesters in Boaz's field. No declarations. No dramatic visions. Just hard work, humble faith, and a God who was weaving redemption in the soil beneath her feet. Maybe you're there right now. Working in a field that doesn't feel like your future. Doing work that feels small, while wondering if God has forgotten the deeper desires of your heart. But Ruth's story tells us something sacred. Sometimes God hides favor inside fields of ordinary obedience. And those who remain faithful in obscurity are often the ones heaven is preparing for extraordinary grace. Share this with someone who's been sowing, working, or waiting in silence. And if you're walking through a season of showing up even when no one sees, write this below. God still visits the edges of the field. The kindness of Boaz, when grace walks into the ordinary. Have you ever been surprised by kindness you didn't ask for? A door opened where you expected silence. A voice that spoke gently when you had prepared for rejection. A moment of grace in the middle of your survival season. That's what happened to Ruth in the fields of Bethlehem. She hadn't come looking for favor. She came to glean, to gather scraps left behind, to feed Naomi, to be faithful with what little she could reach. But Boaz saw her. Not in a romanticized, idealized way. He saw her story. He heard what she had done. And he honored it. Boaz was a man of standing. Wealthy. Respected. He could have dismissed Ruth with a glance. She was a foreigner. A widow. A gleaner in his field. Nothing about her status demanded his attention. But kindness has a different set of eyes. He didn't just allow Ruth to glean, he invited her. He told her to stay close to his servant girls. He warned his men not to lay a hand on her. He offered her water drawn from the jars meant for his workers. In a culture where women like Ruth were often overlooked, or worse, exploited, Boaz protected her dignity. And when Ruth fell at his feet in astonishment, she asked the question many of us ask when grace finds us. Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner? Ruth 2 verse 10. Boaz's answer had nothing to do with attraction or pity. He didn't speak of beauty. He spoke of loyalty. I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Ruth 2 verses 11 to 12. What a picture. Boaz didn't see Ruth as a beggar. He saw her as a woman who had taken shelter under God's wings. And he positioned himself as an extension of that shelter. That's what grace looks like in ordinary life. It doesn't always sound like thunder or split the skies open. Sometimes it comes in the form of a generous landowner who tells the harvesters to leave extra behind. Sometimes it looks like someone noticing, not your need but your faithfulness. At mealtime, Boaz went further. He invited Ruth to sit at his table. He passed her roasted grain with his own hands. And the scripture says Ruth ate until she was satisfied and had some left over. Imagine that. The same woman who woke that morning hoping just to survive the day, was now sitting at the table of a man who would become her redeemer, eating more than she needed, with provision spilling over. That's what happens when God's grace interrupts the ordinary. That evening, when Ruth returned to Naomi, her arms full of barley, Naomi's heart stirred. Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Ruth replied, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Naomi stopped. The air must have shifted. Boaz. He is one of our guardian redeemers. In that moment, something long buried in Naomi began to flicker again. Hope. Not manufactured optimism, but a fragile, holy hope that maybe, just maybe, God was still writing something redemptive into their lives. Boaz hadn't just given Ruth grain. He had restored dignity. He had honored sacrifice. He had made space for someone the world had no place for. And that is the heartbeat of redemption. To see what others overlook. To cover what others shame. To lift what the world leaves behind. Maybe you found yourself gleaning lately, trying to be faithful, working in the shadows. And maybe you're wondering if anyone sees. If your kindness matters. If your consistency means anything. It does. God still raises up Boaz-like hearts in the world. People who protect, provide, and reflect the kindness of heaven. And He's still the God who lets your faithfulness be seen in the right field, at the right time, by the right eyes. Share this with someone who's forgotten how much kindness can change a life. And if you've ever been surprised by grace in an unexpected place, write this below. God saw me when no one else did. Under the wings of God, the night at the threshing floor. Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision that terrified you, because obedience didn't feel safe but you knew it was right? Where stepping forward meant risking misunderstanding, rejection, and exposure. Where what you needed couldn't be demanded, only entrusted. That's the night Ruth walked toward. The harvest season had come to an end. The fields that once pulsed with activity now stood quiet under the hush of the evening breeze. Grain had been gathered, barley winnowed, and for many, it was a time of celebration. For Boaz, the threshing floor was a place of labor and watchfulness. A man didn't leave his harvest unattended. He slept near it, protected it, watched over what he had worked for. But that night, as Boaz prepared to lie down at the far end of the heap of grain, something divine was also at work. He wasn't just guarding barley. He was unknowingly about to receive a request that would ripple across generations. Naomi had seen it coming. As days turned to weeks, and Ruth continued gleaning in Boaz's fields, Naomi's mind had been stirring. She had watched Boaz's kindness, heard his blessing, and remembered who he was, not just a landowner but a Goel, a guardian redeemer. One who had the right, not the obligation, to redeem the property and the name of a deceased relative. In a world where widows had little hope, a redeemer wasn't just a rescuer, it was survival. And Naomi, worn by grief but still fiercely wise, looked at Ruth and said, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for?" Ruth 3 verse 1. Then came the instructions. Washington, anoint yourself. Put on your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor. Wait until Boaz has finished eating and drinking and lies down. Then go, uncover his feet and lie there. These words might sound strange to us. But in that culture, Ruth's actions would carry deep symbolic meaning. She wasn't offering herself in seduction. She was making a covenantal request, asking Boaz to spread his garment over her. In Hebrew, this was a request for covering, for redemption. It was bold. It was dangerous. A Moabite woman approaching a Jewish man in the middle of the night. One accusation, one misstep, and her entire future could unravel. But Ruth didn't protest. She didn't argue. She simply said, "I will do whatever you say." And so, as the stars gathered in the sky, Ruth walked alone to the threshing floor. Each step measured, each breath sacred. She waited. She watched. And when Boaz lay down, Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. It was a posture of humility, of submission, of trust. At midnight, Boaz stirred. Startled, he turned, and found a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low, heart racing. Ruth answered not with hesitation but with clarity. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Ruth 3 verse 9. There it was. Not a flirtation. Not desperation. A holy request. Wrap me in your covenant. Redeem what is broken. Make room in your story for mine. And Boaz, moved by more than surprise, answered with grace. "The Lord bless you. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask." Ruth 3 verses 10 to 11. He spoke not with hesitation but honor. He called Ruth a woman of noble character. He told her there was one closer in line who must be asked first, but that he would settle the matter quickly. And then, under the silent witness of heaven, he did not touch her. He protected her integrity. He guarded her name. And he sent her home before dawn, with 6 measures of barley carried in her shawl, a sign to Naomi and to Ruth herself that she would not return empty-handed. When Ruth returned, Naomi's eyes searched her face, her voice gentle but knowing. "How did it go, my daughter?" Ruth told her everything. And Naomi, smiling with the wisdom of one who had dared to hope again, said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And isn't that just like our Redeemer? When we lay down at his feet, not with demands but with surrender, he moves. He responds. He acts not out of obligation but out of love. And he covers us not with garments but with grace. Maybe you know what it feels like to lay your story at someone else's mercy. Maybe you've brought your broken chapters to the threshing floor, waiting to see if anyone would respond with mercy instead of judgment. Maybe, like Ruth, You've dared to ask for covering when you had nothing to offer but your history and your hope. This is the truth. When you trust yourself to the right Redeemer, you will never be left uncovered. Share this with someone who is waiting in a season of vulnerability. And if you've ever trusted God with your story, even when it scared you, write this below. Cover me, Lord. I trust you with my story. Redemption sealed, when the stranger becomes family. Have you ever stood on the edge of an answered prayer and realized the cost wasn't in receiving, it was in the waiting? You had done all you could. You had laid it all down. Now the outcome rested in hands that weren't yours anymore. That's where Ruth was. She had done everything right, served faithfully, obeyed quietly, spoken humbly, and waited bravely. Now she stood back and watched as Boaz moved forward. The morning after the threshing floor, Boaz did exactly what Naomi had predicted. He went to the town gate, the place where legal matters were handled, where elders gathered, where futures were decided. There, Boaz sat down and waited for the man who was first in line to redeem Elimelech's estate. The man arrived, unsuspecting. Boaz greeted him respectfully. "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." What followed was more than a transaction. It was a sacred unfolding of God's divine orchestration, made public. Boaz laid out the situation. Naomi was selling the land that belonged to her late husband. As the closest relative, the man had the right to redeem it. The man agreed. He saw the opportunity, land, property, perhaps a name for himself. But Boaz wasn't finished. On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the deceased, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Suddenly everything changed. The man pulled back. "Then I cannot redeem it," he said, "because it might endanger my own estate." To take Ruth as wife meant more than marrying a foreign woman. It meant raising a child in the name of another man. It meant transferring inheritance not to his legacy, but to someone else's line. He wanted the land but not the covenant. He wanted the gain, not the sacrifice. So he removed his sandal in accordance with custom and passed it to Boaz, publicly declaring, "I yield the right. It is yours." And in that moment the story turned. Boaz stood before the elders and declared, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." Ruth 4 verses 9 to 10. He didn't call her the Moabite to shame her. He said it to honor her, to make it clear to everyone that he was receiving her with full knowledge of her story. No erasure, no disguise, no pretending she was something she wasn't. He claimed her as she was, and gave her a new future. And the town responded, not with hesitation but with blessing. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. May your family be like that of Perez, through Tamar." They blessed Ruth, a Moabite, a widow, a foreigner. They blessed the woman no one would have expected to be part of God's covenant story. And then Boaz took her home. He took her not just into his household but into his heart, into his name, into his legacy. And the Lord, in his timing, in his mercy, gave Ruth conception. She bore a son. And when the baby was born, Naomi's arms, once emptied by sorrow, were filled again. The same Naomi who had said, "Call me Mara, for the Lord has made me bitter," now held a child who would carry her family line forward. The women of the town rejoiced with her. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Ruth 4 verses 14 to 15. Let that last line rest in your soul for a moment. Better than 7 sons. In a culture where sons were prized, where lineage depended on men, God said, look at Ruth. Look at the one everyone dismissed. The one who had nothing but faith and obedience. She didn't just become a wife. She didn't just bear a son. She became part of the very line that would give birth to a king. Obed was his name. He would be the father of Jesse. Jesse the father of David. David the forefather of Christ. Redemption wasn't just a restored life. It was an eternal lineage. And all of it began with a foreigner who dared to follow a bitter woman back to Bethlehem, who gleaned when others feasted, who obeyed when she could have quit, who lay down in trust and rose up in favor. Maybe today you feel like the outsider, the one with too much past, not enough lineage. Maybe you're walking through unfamiliar spaces, wondering if obedience has been worth it. If your faith, quiet and unglamorous, is really seen. Let Ruth remind you. God writes legacy through those the world overlooks. He brings family out of the foreigner. He turns famine into harvest. And he takes women who gather in fields and places them in the bloodline of kings. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that their name, their faith, and their future still matter to God. And if you've ever stepped into a season where you felt adopted by grace, even though you felt unworthy, write this below. I'm not just rescued. I have been made family. The bloodline of grace, what Ruth's story tells us today. Have you ever looked back on a painful chapter and realized God wasn't just healing your past, He was building your future through it? Have you ever wondered if your small, quiet faith, your obedience in a hidden season, was doing more than just carrying you through the moment? Ruth's story answers those questions with a resounding yes. When we last saw her, she was no longer gleaning in the fields, no longer the Moabite outsider. She had become the wife of Boaz, the mother of Obed, the joy of Naomi's old age. But the beauty of Ruth's story is that it doesn't end there. In fact, that's where its greatest meaning begins. Because Obed, her son, would become the father of Jesse. And Jesse would become the father of David. David, the shepherd king. The one through whom God promised, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever." 2 Samuel 7 verse 16. And through David came Jesus. Let that sink in. A woman from Moab, a nation born of scandal, rejected in Israel's worship, written off by law, was grafted into the line of the Messiah. Ruth's story was never just about a barley field. It was about the cross. It was about showing us that God doesn't just tolerate the outsider, He chooses them. That redemption isn't a side note to His plan, it is the plan. When Matthew begins his gospel, announcing the arrival of Jesus the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, he includes 5 women in the genealogy, and Ruth is one of them. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Matthew 1 verse 5. She is forever written into the family line of grace. Not as an exception but as a revelation. God wanted us to know. I can take the foreigner and give her a home. I can take the widow and make her a mother. I can take the unknown and make her name echo through eternity. We often look at our lives and wonder if we're making any impact. We pray, we serve, we obey, but it feels slow, unseen, small. And yet Ruth never saw the throne of David. She never heard the name of Jesus. She never read the gospel that bore her name in its opening lines. But because she stayed, gleaned, obeyed, and trusted, she became a thread in the very story that would one day wrap the world in salvation. Maybe your life doesn't feel extraordinary right now. Maybe you're raising children or walking through grief or laboring in a place that feels overlooked. But legacy doesn't begin with applause. It begins with obedience. It begins when you say, like Ruth, "Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And you mean it even when it costs you everything. It begins when you keep showing up, even when the field is unfamiliar. It begins when you trust that God sees you, even when no one else does. Ruth's life teaches us that grace isn't afraid of where you come from. It's not limited by your bloodline, your reputation, or your failures. Grace chooses. Grace restores. Grace redeems. And grace never wastes a willing heart. If God could bring the Messiah through the womb of a widowed foreigner, He can write His purposes through you. So don't despise your small beginnings. Don't disqualify yourself because of where you started. Don't measure your life by the size of your platform. Measure it by your faithfulness to God. Because legacy doesn't always look like royalty. Sometimes it looks like a woman gathering grain at the edges of a field, unaware that heaven is tracing every step. Share this with someone who feels like their life doesn't carry weight. And if you've been walking by faith, believing that even your small obedience matters, write this below. My story is part of something eternal. I choose grace. Thank you for walking through Ruth's story. Her name means companion, and may you carry her courage with you as you follow the one who always redeems. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of knowing that your story too can become part of the bloodline of grace.